Hi everybody, my name is Maria Eriksson. I'm a professor of social work here at Maria Cederschiöld University, and I will share with you some thoughts on children's agency in the context of intimate partner violence, with a focus on the everyday life and recovery post-separation, in conjunction with the finishing of this project of children and post-separation stalking. I would like to start to say something about, or linking back to the knowledge we have on children and intimate partner violence and experiences of violence in a family context. Because we today have a very large body of research about how violence in a family setting and children's experiences of that and exposure to it is often both long-term and become part of their everyday life, in the sense that it affects all the aspects of their relationships with their parents, both abused parents and violent parents, siblings, and it also affects their relationships with their age mates, their peers, and adults outside of the family. There's also a substantial body of knowledge by now about the negative effects the violence will have for children, both in a long-term and short-term, of course, perspective. We know, for example, about the link between violence in the adult relationship and the violence directed at children themselves. And children may be injured by the violence, but also the emotional and behavioral aspects and consequences of violence, behavior problems and problems with emotional regulation, fear, shame and guilt, low self-esteem, and also PTSD symptoms, which are considerably or comparatively to other groups of children at risk, actually quite common in this group, and so forth and so on. On the other hand, we also know that children respond individually. There are also a number of protective factors, not least the relationship with the non-abusive parent, typically the mother in these relationships, that will help the child to cope. We also know that children develop different coping strategies and also strengths. They learn about life through this difficult situation that they live in. And so the research base is really broad and nuanced by now. And one of the conclusions we can draw from all of this is that we need to think very carefully about the outcome for the individual child. That needs to be assessed and recognized. And I will get back to that point a little bit further on. So these are some of the things we know. We also know a lot about children's agency and the way children act, both in relation to the violence and the consequences of violence. We know that children living with intimate partner violence, if we think about violence in the adult relationship, they act to protect themselves and their siblings and parents, the abused parent particularly, even though they can, of course, choose to side with the perpetrating parent too. And without putting blame on children, I also think it's very important that we recognize that children might put themselves in harm's way, as the perpetrator may not consider the needs of the child, or might even become violent towards the child if the perpetrator thinks that the child is interfering with the situation. And I think all of this I'm talking about now is, of course, while the parents are living together, but also in a post-separation context, and not least in also the stalking context. A perpetrator might actually consider the child interfering, and the stalking behavior might be linked to that. I also think by now we have more research about how the wider network responds to children in these situations. And we know that there might be expectations among family or next of kin, or perhaps even within the professional network, that children should act as protection, especially when children are becoming older. So I will also get back to this point about children's role in protection in a post-separation and a stalking context. And of course, children may use violence themselves to stop the perpetrator. So these are just some of the things we know about what children do in situations with violence and in relation to violence. We also know quite a lot about what children think. We know that children try to deal with the consequences of violence. They try to understand. For many children, it's quite hard to understand why this is happening in the family and why the perpetrator is doing what typically he is doing. They have different ways of making sense of the violence, of trying to figure out how this all works. They also have different opportunities and different levels of help in creating meaning in relation to the violence. And here, of course, in terms of helping children to develop a kind of narrative about narrative identity, where the violence and the history of violence is part of it, that's a really important part of the help. And here, of course, again, parents can help children, but then, of course, they need to recognize the violence and what the violence has meant for the child. So children both do a lot and think a lot in relation to violence, both while parents are living together and in a post-separation context and a post-separation stalking context. But the question is, how much do we think that children do actually in terms of dealing with the violence and its aftermath? Here I would like to bring in the discussion about young carers. In the last decades, there's been a growing body of research internationally, but not so much in the Nordic countries, even though some studies are now emerging, about young carers, about children who take on so much caring responsibilities. They actually do so much that we can consider it work, in a way, care work, for their parents for different reasons. And this body of research has been very separate from the research on violence and children exposed to violence. So I want to bring these two bodies of research together here. In terms of young carers more generally, we know that what distinguishes this group, how we can identify the group of young carers from children in vulnerable situations more broadly, is the lack of choice. They do care because there's nobody else there. They have no choice. We also know that they do significantly more in terms of housework, for example, shopping, cleaning, than other young people. I mean, with growing age, everybody should help out at home, but we're not talking about helping out. We're talking about children taking on perhaps sometimes the main responsibility for maintaining the household. We're also talking about children who take on the overarching responsibility for the situation at home. They also do things that other children rarely do in terms of helping with healthcare or personal hygiene and care activities like that. They also provide more emotional support to the parents than children in general. And we're talking about an extent of care responsibilities that competes with school and peer relationships and leisure time activities and so forth. In terms of some families where children are carers, live under economic hardship, young people may take on financial responsibilities to an extent that it actually competes with further education. They stop going to school to try and work to help financially with the family economy. And as with many other groups of vulnerable children, we also see that young carers can be subject to bullying because they can't take part in peer relationships like other children can, or young people. So how is this linked to violence then? Well, in terms of children and violence, we have been talking about them internationally, but also in the Nordic countries, like moving from just considering these children as witnesses to violence, as somehow being outside, to consider them as victims. And especially from the Swedish point of view, at the time when I hold this lecture, it's fairly recent that we've had the new law on the violation of children's integrity, which actually criminalizes making children witnesses of crime against a parent or a care person. So we moved from not recognizing these children to actually recognize them as kind of crime victims in their own right. But the question is, are they also young carers sometimes? I mean, I think that the research we have on children's agency in relation to violence actually indicates that sometimes they take on such a responsibility for care that we can consider them also young carers, in addition to being crime victims. And we might also think about the different patterns that we can see when children live with their abused parent and the violent parent, because that might, of course, differ. So just to give you some examples of the violence-specific forms of care that I think that we can see in the research is that, I mean, we know that a lot of children are actually present in situations with violence, both while the parents are living together in a post-separation context. And if the parent gets injured, or if a sibling gets injured, children might actually be part of providing healthcare in that situation and also in times of recovery. We know that children in general who live with violence, they give a lot of emotional support to the parents. But giving emotional support to a parent who's actually suffering from PTSD, we know that parents can be traumatized themselves, or parents who actually get depressed by being subjected to violence, that is at a different level than just supporting the parent. I also think that we think about the level of involvement that children have in terms of assessing risk and planning for safety and trying to ensure safety, both in relation to the victimized parent or the parent subjected to violence and or siblings, and also in relation to the perpetrating parents in terms of controlling the perpetrating parent. It's to such an extent that we perhaps should think about them as young carers rather than just children. It's about recognizing the kind of amount of work that this actually takes for children. And also in terms of knowing how much different agencies get involved when we get violence, and especially in a post-separation context. There may be different parts of the welfare system, there might be different legal processes, and some children take on a very central role in coordinating and supporting the parent in all these processes. And that, of course, raises the question of where do we draw the line between caregiving and actually being subjected to continued victimization if we think about perpetrators actually using the system to continue the violence, the control, the punishment for leaving and so forth and so on, the stalking. I want to bring this up because I'm thinking about the views we have on children when we encounter them within the welfare system and social work, especially, of course, since I come from social work. Me and colleagues, we've written in different places about this double view on children that shapes our societies and shapes the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, where we, on the one hand, we adopt this care perspective on children, where we consider children as different from adults. They are developing, dependent upon adults. It's adults who make decisions and have responsibility for decision making regarding children. And we, in a way, approach children as becoming, to quote a way of framing children common in childhood research. On the one hand, we also consider children as basically people with human rights, just like adults. And we approach them much more like same as adults in the sense of recognizing that they are social actors, they are competent, they know about their own views, they are holders of rights, including rights to participation. And we consider children more as beings as well. So when encountering children exposed to violence, we do need to find ways of combining these two approaches in a more holistic view on children, including when encountering children who are affected by post-separation stalking. So the question is, how prepared are we to adopt these two approaches? According to some researchers on child welfare systems, they will argue that we've been moving from a system, both if we look at in terms of policy, how policy is developed, and also how it's put into practice, where we've moved from child protection, which is a model very much shaped by a kind of care perspective on children, this protective approach, or a family service, where the focus is also very much on adult views on the child as an object in a way for adult interventions, to what researchers call a child-centered welfare system. And what distinguishes a child-centered approach is that it basically recognizes children's legal rights in organizational procedures, the right of participation, for example. And also this thing about recognizing children as individuals with particular interests and needs in interaction with adults, which of course in terms of the different effects of violence and the different consequences affecting children becomes really, really important when we talk about children exposed to violence. And also the way systems use the individual child's viewpoint to interpret what the world means to children and what is the best for the child. So how far are we then child-centered in terms of our welfare systems and how we encounter these children? Is there space to recognize their agency and give space for their agency? We may ask ourselves. Together with a colleague, I would have argued that in terms of the welfare system and the welfare regime shaping, especially the Nordic countries, it seems to be that on the one hand, our welfare systems are quite advanced and developed, but less so when it comes to issues of bodily integrity compared to dealing with poverty and redistribution of health and compensating for economic hardship. And in terms of issues of bodily integrity, but also other issues like, for example, this thing of young carers, it seems like our Nordic countries are quite underdeveloped. A comparison between different welfare systems that Sol Becker, who has been researching young carers a lot, did quite a long time ago. He would argue that the issues even preliminary or emerging, possibly, if you think about young carers as an issue in the Swedish welfare system. And in terms of Sweden, if I speak from the Swedish point of view, this issue of recognizing the kind of amount of care burden, so to speak, that children take on, it's not even there in policy. There's no discussion about relieving children or helping children out. I mean, basically, carers are adults as far as Swedish policy is concerned. So what about the issue of children's participation then? I mean, they're comparing the situation in Sweden with the UK, for example. What we could see is that there's much less training in social work programs in communicating with children. We have much fewer advocacy groups by children, for children, to push for children's rights within the welfare system. And we also have significantly fewer examples of children as partners in knowledge development about practice within the welfare system. So that is, I think that's a food for thought in terms of what does that mean? Or perhaps we could think, do we need it then? Perhaps our welfare system works so well, we don't need a critical gaze from children themselves. Well, I would beg to differ in the sense that looking at some of the studies, I will just give you one example here. Haven't got time for more. I'm thinking of Zlatan Aknesevich, who investigated in different ways the Swedish child welfare investigation system, BBIC, which is the Swedish version of the integrated children's system used in many countries. Looking at the guidance for practitioners given by the Swedish version of the system, and looking at how this guidance constructs the child, she could find that children are portrayed as amoral, which in the sense of being incapable of autonomous moral reasoning, more like considering them more like some kind of part of their families, this kind of familiarization of children that others have been writing about. It's quite strong in this guidance for practitioners. She also found some portrayals of children as immoral, I mean, in terms of discussing them as antisocial or the delinquent youths, basically. She also found some portrayals of children as capable of moral reasoning, but in that sense, they were also portrayed as problematic at the same time, because they were problematically loyal to parents and thus not willing to share experiences of violence with adults, professionals, for example. So in terms of the guidance, it seems like children who take an independent moral stance, who actually have views of their own about parents who engage in continued violent behavior or stalking behavior post-separation, that kind of child does not exist in the guidance. It's like empty or silent about a competent child. What Zlatan Aknesevich shows is how guidance for practitioners is shaped by what she would call epistemic injustice, borrowed from Miranda Fricker, and how some groups of people, like children, their knowledge and moral reasoning is kind of disregarded in the adult system. She also adds to this picture by looking at, on the one hand, we have this kind of lack of recognition of children as competent actors in the welfare system. At the same time as we have this demand and discussion about evidence-based practice and evidence, and looking at the kind of evidence needed to take children into care from empirical cases, she could show that practitioners tend to, rather than listening to what children say about their voices, about their experiences of violence or stalking, have a tendency to look for signs of evidence, which seems to be more about damaged bodies and underdeveloped minds, so to speak. And this idea of needing evidence and the culture of evidencing kind of disregards children's voices, or may lead to that, is her argument. And she can show that also through some of other analyses that I've put some references in at the end of this speech. And we also have some other authors who've been looking at how children have been dealt with in the Swedish welfare system, and arguing that there is this intrinsic problem with a very strong family orientation in the Swedish social services, in spite of this idea of some colleagues that we have a more child-centered system now. They point to this reliance of partnership with parents built into the system. And also that in spite of ideas of child-centeredness, there seemed to be a very protective approach as an ethos running through the system to a very large extent still. And they could also show by following cases that when children are not given a voice or opportunity to influence the framing of what the problem is, the design of intervention doesn't match what's actually the problems documented in the child protection investigations. And of course, if children have a say, the interventions better match what children actually need. And of course, we can ask ourselves, so what does this mean, or what can we learn from this, or what is the situation in the context of post-separation arrangements? Well, first of all, we know from quite a lot of research that there seems to be this split between welfare interventions focusing on family law issues and welfare interventions that focus on child welfare or child protection. Organizationally, in terms of policy, in terms of professional views and identities, there seems to be different planets, if I quote my colleague Marianne Hester from the UK. So I guess the question is this, what I've just hinted at, the lack of recognition of children's agency in child welfare. What does that look like in family law? Is it any better there? Well, I wouldn't necessarily presume so. We have quite a lot of research today, both from Sweden and Finland and other countries, that there seems to be huge problems in recognizing violence at all in a family law context. And just the most recent example is this survey made by the Authority for Gender Equality in Sweden, looking at court cases, showing the same thing now as was shown like a study 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that social workers, to some extent, it has improved a bit in the social work investigation side, but in terms of the legal processes and decisions in court, which are of course central for the safety and well-being of children in terms of violence, post-separation and post-separation stalking, the report shows that both social workers and especially the courts underestimate violence and the need for protection and safety in decisions regarding both custody or parental responsibility, residence, and contact or access issues. So the risk is that we end up with the situation where children in a post-separation and post-separation stalking context end up being these young carers who keep on taking on responsibility for both coordinating all the different contacts, negotiating all the different needs, and also putting their own needs for a normal life, an everyday childhood post-separation. They put that on hold to help out and take responsibility for all the needs in the family, which are upheld by the continued post-separation stalking behavior by the perpetrator. So here we really need to recognize the situation of children and young people, their views, what the violence has meant for the individual child, but also recognize the amount of care and care work that they engage in and perhaps are forced to engage in if the system doesn't respond to their needs, and including the needs for safety and protection post-separation. So thank you very much for listening. There were some thoughts about what's important to take with you when encountering children who experience violence in their family, live in a post-separation context, and with experiences of post-separation stalking. I'll add some references that you can look at.